Hello, welcome to video. Cannot believe it's 2024. Also, cannot believe it's now February, which means that I need to sit down here and tell you about all the books I read in January. And the year is off to kind of a slow start. So my goal every year is to read one more book than the year before. And I have my little Goodreads challenge going and everything, right? So last year I read 70 books. It was a success. So this year I need to try and read 71. Naturally, I am already behind because I only finished 4 books in January. So, you know, off to a slow start. But to begin with, we finally can say that I have finished The Expanse. I read Leviathan Falls by James S.A. Corey. And 5 stars. Like, I really loved it. I love the whole series. And I had spent last year rereading it in anticipation of finally getting to the final book, which I had not read before. See what I'm saying? And that was Leviathan Falls, and I had a really great time with it. It was pretty wild. I wasn't like super interested in the one new character that we were following, but I mean, I feel like she was contributing, you know, something to the narrative that it needed, but I just didn't think she was that interesting. But, you know, I don't know, whatever. There was a lot of wild stuff in this book. Like, I don't know, I can't really go into it because, you know, it's book 9 of a series. Like, none of it's gonna make any sense, but everything needed to get resolved. The fact that reality itself was low-key falling apart needed to get resolved, especially. A lot of crazy stuff was going on. And I predicted part of the way that it would end, but not any of the real details. Just like one basic thing where I was like, okay, X is definitely gonna happen. And I was right. So, I'm not gonna say what it is, I guess, because that's nobody watches these videos. I could spoil it, but I'm just gonna not do that, okay? I'm just gonna pretend for a minute that anybody cares and that I should just keep it to myself. But the ending was sad, honestly. Like, I wouldn't necessarily call it satisfying. I would say more that just it was like, yeah, they solved the issue, but I'm depressed about it. However, I am really glad that I read it. So like, apparently James S.A. Corey, who is 2 guys, I don't know how they came up with that pseudonym, and I'm like intensely curious and I want to know. But anyway, they are coming out with a new series, I guess. So there's a book anticipated being published later this year by them, and I'm pretty excited about that. It's sci-fi. It doesn't appear to have any connection to The Expanse. I think it's like its whole new thing. Also, there is that book of short stories that are all in the Expanse universe by the 2 of them that were published, I think, in just kind of various places, but were brought together for one book. I might read that later this year. I don't know. Like, I don't want to wait too long, but I also don't care that much. But, you know, I like when I have some time, if I ever have any time, I think I'd like to pick that up and read it. You know, it's stories that are set in between the books or prequel bits or like whatever. So I am curious to see what's in there. But yeah, so finally did it. I did it. I'm successful. And you know what? Let's just transition into what that means for me. What it means for me is that now I'm allowing myself to reread A Song of Ice and Fire. And I immediately picked up Game of Thrones, which I actually own. So that's why I actually have it to show you. Look at this beautiful sword. Okay, so I've read A Song of Ice and Fire before. I fucking love it, to be honest. And it's been a little while though. It's been a little while. And I was actually recently rewatching Game of Thrones, which, like, yeah, I know, but my sister wanted to. And the first few seasons are pretty good, you know? I mean, eventually it falls apart and I quit caring, but like, the first few seasons. Probably, like, honestly, the first 4, season 5's okay. Then it kind of falls apart. But But never mind, that doesn't matter. The only relevance is that watching Game of Thrones was just another bit of like torment to me and how bad I wanted to reread the books. But I was like, no, you gotta finish The Expanse first. So I finally did. And so, I love this book. I love it so much that I don't know how to talk about it. I am absolutely fascinated with all of the characters in the series, and the beginning, you know, it really starts like, it's so interesting just to read the beginnings of the characters, right? Like now that I know where they're headed in the next few books at least, you know, that's what makes a reread fun, is just being like, yeah, I know where these characters are headed, and so interesting to see their beginnings. And oh my god, a lot of wild stuff happens in this book. I think like probably the very ending with Dany is probably the biggest deal thing, but like there's just, wow, there's some stuff in here and I really love it. I'd already said that. I don't know what to say about this book except that I'm very glad to have reread it, and I just really like the way he writes. Like, I like that he spends time describing everything. Like, if I'm gonna read a book that's this long, that's part of a series, you know, I want those descriptions. Like, I have encountered, let's say, I watch a lot of BookTube, right? So I know that there are authors who write very long books who perhaps do not include as much substance. And it just, you know, I am never reading this book and going, why is it so long? I know why it's so long. Every chapter is, you know, has some sort of purpose. Every element of the story is like contributing something. Like, we really get to know the people and the places and the world and like the way stuff works. And there's a lot of plot, and like, it's just a really great time. Hell, honestly, I'll say that like, I was surprised a bit because I feel like this book especially is not as dark and disturbing as some of the later ones, which I guess isn't surprising, but I think we talk about Game of Thrones as kind of this ubiquitousness of like this gritty element, which I don't really, this book has much less of. I think largely because a lot of it, the characters are still, how do I put this? They're still, like, a lot of the characters are the Stark kids, right? And a lot of them are still with their family in this book. Like, everything hasn't totally fallen apart until the end. And even then, it hasn't fully, right? Like, for some of them. So, they're more comfortable, I guess, in this book. Like, everything goes to shit more later. And, like, later in this book, when the war starts and everything, you know, that starts, like, things start falling apart. So I think that the idea, when people talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, the idea that the world is just this constant deluge of horribleness really isn't accurate. Like, a lot of that stuff is happening because there's a war. And, you know, you've got knights and whoever running around with basically doing whatever the fuck they want with impunity. Like, it's not the normal status quo of Westeros for people to just constantly being like burning down holdfasts and murdering people and whatever. It happens when somebody like, say, Gregor Clegane is told by Tywin Lannister, go out and cause chaos, and then he does it. And, like, you know, it's not like the normal state of affairs. Anyway, sorry. I got a phone call. I don't know. They didn't say anything. It was mysterious. Okay, enough about Game of Thrones, though. That was great. And I'm very looking forward to getting to the next book, but like, they're all really long, so it's a little bit intimidating, but also it's kind of like, okay, I have to commit to this taking like 2 weeks, and that's sometimes a little hard. Okay, let's move on now. So I listened to an audiobook last month, Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. What a name. This is about, as you might imagine, the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl, and it was a very interesting book. I have watched the TV series from a few years ago. I think it was on HBO, which is kind of a dramatization of the events of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. A very interesting show called Chernobyl. Did I mention that? Yeah, duh. That thing. I watched that. but I don't actually remember any of the people's names or really, but there were bits where I was listening to the book and being like, oh yeah, that was a thing that happened on that show. So that was kind of fun, I guess, to recall parts of the narrative. It was interesting. It was interesting. Essentially, there were things wrong with that particular type of nuclear power plant, and those things were being ignored, and there was information that was not passed down to like the grunts, to the people really doing the work, and there were people making very stupid decisions, and it's interesting, just also just disturbing how much of this fallout ended up in other parts of Europe, but it's also like this, I guess, almost this like pivotal moment, right? Because this is happening in so bad at years, the late 80s, right? Something like that. And just really just like not that long before the Soviet Union ended up collapsing, and like Chernobyl probably contributed, and at least some of that is because basically they couldn't hide the fact that they'd had this massive nuclear disaster because of all the fallout, like the, you know, being detected in like Finland or whatever. And, you know, I think there was some nuclear power plant in like, I think it was Sweden, that detected all this like stuff because they were regularly testing their employees. You know, when they like came into work or whatever, and it was like, oh shit, something must be wrong here. But then they realized, no, it's not us. So yes, like basically the Soviet Union loved keeping everything secret as much as it possibly could, but this was something that it couldn't. And when it kind of got out, like it got kind of messy, and you know, there were rumors, and there were Western journalists like reporting stuff that didn't turn out to necessarily be true, but like how the hell were they supposed to know that? Finally, the Soviet Union like actually said what happened, I guess, and you know, it was wild. Like, and then all these poor people in Pripyat, which is the town that Chernobyl is like right next to, who mostly, a lot of them worked at the power plant, they all had to like leave forever, and then they had to like, there was this like 30-kilometer radius or whatever around the plant that they had to evacuate, and like just a lot. Very bad, but very interesting, very disturbing. Yeah, great book. Like if you want to learn about Chernobyl, this is the book for it, I think. Okay, and then finally, the final book of the month, because there were only 4, how sad, I read The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark by Carl Sagan, and some of it's by Anne Druyan, or with help from Anne Druyan. I don't know, it's kind of unclear. I've been wanting to read this thing for a few years now, because like I like a Carl Sagan, and it's been a while, but also because this is definitely going, okay, can we talk about, you know, science versus religion, pseudoscience, zealotry, new age thinking, nonsense, like, and, you know, where does some of this stuff come from? Like, the book says that he examines and debunks these things, which, like, kind of. It's not really so much about that. It's not, like, about Sagan going, okay, we're going to talk about demons in this chapter and why they're not real. It's more like him being like, okay, so here's a whole bunch of questions that have never been answered about UFO abductions, and you think they would have been if UFO abductions were a thing that really happened. So why do people believe in them? And I thought one interesting thing is him connecting the idea of UFOs and UFO alien abductions to the idea of demons and witchcraft, and just being like, this is just the new version of that. It's all the same thing. And, you know, why do people believe shit like that? And, you know, talking about people with their whole satanic abuse nonsense. Like, where is that coming from? And how easy it is for people to mess up their own memories. Like, memory, we think of it as being a way more infallible than it actually is. It's very fallible. It's like very, comparatively pretty easy to convince somebody that they have experienced something when they really haven't. Through like hypnosis or therapy, you know, like this never happened, and yet they're like making it up, and they're sincerely believing it. And it's worth knowing. And he talks about, I mean, this is from the 90s, so like some of this is interesting to read, but it also feels like, okay, he's talking about the education system. And it's like, okay, this is all a problem. Is it more of a problem now? Is it less of a problem? I have no idea. So, but also interesting to read the bits where he's talking about, say, like, well, what was it exactly? I think what was striking me was just the way some of the stuff, these kind of like ways of thinking, connect to things that have become like big, weird issues in the modern day, like QAnon, for example, like reading it and being like, oh boy, Carl Sagan, you should be happy that you died when you did, because good God, some of the shit people have come up with since. But also just how obvious it is that these things are connected. Just so interesting. And I would say a worthwhile book to read, because like he makes some good points, right? He definitely makes good points and really digs into how science as a way of interrogating reality works, and why something like a pseudoscience does not. Like basically science is about asking questions and then like looking for evidence and interrogating constantly and whether these things are correct, whereas a religious, let's just be real, viewpoint often, almost always, suppresses the asking of questions. Like you can't ask questions, and has like these tautologies and these just like these defeating cycles where it's like, okay, well, God says so, so therefore, you know, like the idea that it is unknowable, whereas science says, no, it's all knowable, actually. So yeah, I would recommend this one. And I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad I bought it. And I wish I read more books in January, but only 4. And I mean, to be fair, some of them were kind of long, and I had a great time. Like, honestly, I think that's probably what matters the most, right? I had a great time, and I will hopefully read more books in February, but like, you know, it's all about like learning and having a good time reading, you know? It's not really about the numbers. It's a little about the numbers, but mostly it's about reading books I've been looking forward to, reading books that I like, and learning stuff, and, you know, expanding, and blah, 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 blah. So I will be seeing you all next month. But until then, good luck with your reading.